Hey gang, we are in Madison, Wisconsin on this beautiful sunny day, and we are at Resurrection Cemetery here. And we're going to go back to the year 1911. Little girl, 7 years old, was murdered. Still somewhat of a mystery, but there's a lot of clues on what happened. I'm going to tell you the story. So let's walk to the grave, and on the way we'll look at some of the stones. Looks like an older cemetery. And I, as usual, will tell you the story of little Anna Lemberger. They called her Annie, and she was a beautiful little girl. She had light curly hair, bright blue eyes. She was the daughter of Martin and Magdalene Lemberger. She had a little sister and two little brothers. Her father here was a laborer in Madison, and they lived near what was the freight yards back then. A poorer part of town. This was a district that was predominantly, well, occupied by Italians, a lot of Italians, and some Russian Jews. Now, they lived in a very small, you couldn't even call it a house, it was really just a shack. Nothing but a shack. You know, laborers, it was pretty common back then. Imagine the winters here, and the winters are cold and were very cold, but that's all they had. Now, it was the evening of September 5th, 1911, and little Annie, she had just finished school. I think it was the first week or the first day at St. James Parochial School. She was really excited about the school and how she did, and you know, all the usual talk at dinner the family had. 9 o'clock comes and it's time for bed. Little Annie gets tucked in her trundle bed with her little sister, and the boys are right next to her in their trundle bed, and they have the little dog. They're all tucked in. They go to sleep, but sadly there was an intruder who would come and take her. Now, the parents woke up the next day, everybody got up, and little Annie was gone. And no one could explain it or figure it out. But there were some clues. There were some clues. They saw the window was open. They saw that it was pried open, and there was a board that propped it up. So someone had very stealthily got in and probably took her while she was asleep. She was in her nightgown, of course, and her clothing, they said, was next to her bed, untouched. And of course, the kids didn't wake up, which is surprising that even that little dog didn't wake up. Everything was completely silent. So with that, Annie was gone. Now, of course, they started to also look outside, and they noticed that the ground outside was all like tamped down, the grass. So someone apparently had been there for a while, maybe watching through the window. Who knows, waiting for Annie to go to bed. So the police were called, chief of police got involved, Shaughnessy, And there was a massive, massive search undertaken. And they checked the railroad cars, they checked all the abandoned houses, they even checked with the neighbors. They, of course, checked the lakes. We have two big lakes here, Lake Mendota and Lake Monona. They dragged the lakes and they did everything they could, but there was just no sign of little Annie. It was very, very confusing. And of course, everyone was looking for her, but no luck. Well, a few days later, all of a sudden, there's some news that comes out. There was a guy who, and by the way, I should say, I wanted to just say that I was reading the newspaper. It's really interesting how they phrase things. They said, well, maybe she was kidnapped, but you know, Martin didn't make any money, so it couldn't have been kidnapping. So they speculated, and the quote was, maybe some crazed person took her who was impressed by her childish beauty. It's another way of saying, you know what. But it's just interesting how they phrase things back then. So a few days later, there was a cement worker who was by Lake Monona. It was 3 days later, actually on September 9th, they found her body. She was spotted at daybreak by George Younger. That was his name. And she was floating in the bay just 10 feet off the shore at a place called Keys Sand Pit, south side of the city limits. She didn't have any weights tied to her body. You'd think, put her in the lake, they'd try to weigh her down. But no. She was naked. They did find a bruise around her head by her ear. There was a laceration on her ear. They thought she might have been strangled. Her neck looked to be a little injured, but no real injuries to her body. There was really nothing big that they noticed. So they took her to the undertaking room, as they called it, and they said that she had a very peaceful expression when she was laid out. Interestingly, though, Chief of Police, they inspected her body further, and they did determine that she was not, quote unquote, criminally assaulted, not violated. Doctors confirmed this, and they also determined that there was no water in her lungs, so she had to have been murdered before and then brought to and dumped into the lake. Now, they questioned her father, Martin. Interestingly, he had a lot of conflicting stories going. They weren't interrogating him, but you know, they had to question him. But they wrote that off, that, well, he's confused, he's in shock, delirious, which he probably was. So they kind of wrote it off to that. They really just had no leads and nothing going on. So that's where the case sat. But interestingly, further, 5 days later, on September 14th, there were headlines from the Appleton Evening Crescent. It's the newspaper. And the headlines read, "Rushed off to prison. Dogskin Johnson confesses to brutal murder of Lemberger girl. Crazed by mob fear. Madison degenerate and ex-convict in complete confession tells of a murder." pleads guilty and is sentenced to life imprisonment in Waupun. Now, Waupun is the big prison still to the north here in the center of the state. It turned out that a neighbor of the Lembergers, a man named John A. Johnson, just admitted to the whole thing. His nickname was Dogskin. He was suspected from the onset. And Chief Shaughnessy and Detective Patrick Boyd, they immediately arrested him. He wouldn't say anything, but then they told him there was a lynch mob and it was forming outside. And this terrified the heck out of Dogskin. So they played that up. They interrogated him in the 3rd degree. And I'll give you some quotes from them. This Detective Boyd, he said, "Come on now, Johnson, tell us how it happened. We will sneak you out of town and save you from the mob." And then they said, Johnson cried out, "The mob!" He was cringing in his cell. And he was in the women's department of the jail, isolated. He goes, "They'll get me and they'll burn me." And Boyer goes, "Not if you tell the truth." "Let me look out the window," begged Johnson. So they let him look out the window into the empty street, but what did he see in his panicked and confused state? All he saw, or rather imagined, was a street filled with raging people. He was so worried up and worked up by these guys that all he could think of was, these people are going to kill me. So he crawled back into his cot and he cried and he said, "Okay, I'll tell you the story." And he said, "I've known little Annie for a long time. She was a pretty child and I liked her. I knew where all the Lembergers slept. I'd been drinking. I thought I'd like to see little Annie sleeping, so I opened the window. It was easy. I looked at her a moment. The cold air woke her up. In her fright, she said, 'Johnson!' I knew she had recognized me, so I reached over and I grabbed her. Honestly, I did not intend to kill her. I was afraid she would tell her father, though, and call him, so I pulled her out the window. And I don't remember anything else." So then they asked him, they said, "The lake, what about the lake?" And then he remembered, he goes, "Yes, we went to the lake, little Annie and I. I carried her. And after that, I don't remember. I reckon I slipped back home and went to bed." So they said, "Look at the mob outside." And of course, Dogskin was like, all he could think of was, the mob, the mob. They're clamoring for my blood. So the next day comes, and of course, now he meets with his lawyer, and unsurprisingly, he recants everything. Didn't help, though. He got life, sent to Waupun prison for life. With 1 day each year on the anniversary of this crime, he was served only in solitary confinement, bread and water. So you say to yourself, wow, that's the end of the story, right? Well, no, hardly the end of the story. 10 years later, a family member comes forward, it perhaps was one of the children, the brothers or the sister maybe, came forward, and all of a sudden there was new evidence. The father was blamed. And apparently what happened, what really might have happened, according to family testimony in the cover-up, was that father, Martin, her father, Martin, was standing there or sitting in his chair, and he asked her to get the fire poker, you know, to stew up the the sparks and get the fire going. She couldn't find it. So he, this guy's a drinker, I guess, and he took his beer bottle and he whipped it at her, little Annie, and he smashed her right in the head across the room. Again, it's probably 5 or 10 feet away, in the shack, and it knocks her out. So they put her to bed, and then they come to, you have to imagine him and the mom, Magdalene. They're like, she's dead. What do we do? So they arranged for this whole thing. They had, the kids were sleeping, and they apparently had taken little Annie and put her in the lake and possibly staged all this, which is just incredible. So they, when that happened, they did charge Lemberger, Martin, and further investigation was done. Here we have some porcelains. Unusual at some of these cemeteries. The Catholic cemeteries usually don't see porcelains. Usually it's going to be Italian or Eastern Bloc countries, and you see the last name here, Rada. Yeah, this is Italian. You can see the last name. But anyway, what do we have? We have statute of limitations. Past the statute of limitations, so they can't do anything about it. They can't arrest Martin, they can't take him to trial, but it sure changed everything. So the governor of Wisconsin here back then, he immediately, which is a good thing, got Dogskin out of Wapping up there to the north, and they let him go. The guy's in there for 10 years of his life. And this, those confessions, those forced confessions were common back then. But anyway, that's kind of where the story rests, that I'm not sure. What do you think? I mean, it had to be Martin, right? I mean, the family members come forward, but maybe it was Dogskin. Don't know. But here we are at the grave, right hidden behind here in these hostas. There is the Lemberger stone. And you can see there, it says, daughter Anna, born 1904. And it says, kidnapped September 6th, found, death, September 9th, 1911. I think I might have said the 10th, but it had to be the 9th, I guess, because that's what's on the stone. And then you see, let's see here, see if we can see lower. Sun is directly, there's no other way to, oh, you can still see. There we go. So you can see we've got son Joseph. He was born in 1913, so he was probably, what, 1904, Anna was born. So he was born after she passed, after this all happened. Daughter Marie M., 1908. So that was her little sister who was in the trundle bed. Right? So there it is. And I'm going to put a yellow rose up here. For little Annie. Little Annie. Well, that's the story. Who did it? Was it Martin? I think so. I think probably Martin did it. But I guess we'll never know. All right, from Madison, Wisconsin, thanks for walking with me, and rest in peace. Rest in peace, little Annie. We'll see you on the next one, gang.